Today we're talking about Tyr's new buff. Now if you remember my past videos about Tyr, I am usually not the biggest fan of Tyr, and I was pretty unhappy with various buffs he received all the time, down to the point that I actually had a shirt at one point with the caption "Tyr buff was needed," and that was of course ironic. But I will say that I actually believe that Tyr needed a buff. Now I don't think he needed a massive buff, but Tyr was not exactly present on higher levels of play at least, and even on casual levels he wasn't an extremely popular god from what I saw at least. And to no one's surprise, Tyr got a buff. What was surprising was the content of that buff. His Fearless would no longer disarm enemies, but instead it would now knock up enemies. And this is in a sense a revert to the early stages of Tyr, when both of his charges, both of his Fearless abilities would also knock up. So this is nothing exactly new, but that was at a very different time, in a very different meta with a very different focus on balance and different items and different stats on Tyr surrounding that. Hi-Rez reasoned the buff as follows: no one is above the law. After multiple buffs that seemed impactful, Tyr has still struggled to find a place in the meta. Now we are doing a big revert back to Tyr's glory days. Fearless in defense stance is having its knock-up returned. This should allow Tyr to continue pressuring enemies and setting up for his team, even if the offensive Fearless combo fails. I find it interesting that this is called a revert to his glory days, because glory days, I guess, can be looked at as days where a god was just extremely strong and slightly overpowered at least, or they could be looked at the days where a god was actually very balanced, which I personally would prefer. Now the first question is, how warranted was this Tyr buff from a statistical perspective? If we look at his casual stats from casualsmite.com of the patch before he got his buff, his win rate was at 48.46% in casual conquest among experienced players, so not sub-level 30s. That is not the greatest win rate, but it's also not absolutely terrible. So his stats here were okay with a 1.91 KDA. He was definitely not top tier either, but again, far from bad. And we can also look at smite.gg for the ranked stats. Across all ranks, I'm not going to look at the stats here because they're basically the same as on the casual level, around the same win rate of 48 point something as well. But we can also look at Platinum Plus specifically for the more experienced, more skilled players, where we can see that here his win rate goes up a little bit to 49.52%. And it also had a decent bump there from the patch beforehand by 3.3%. So again, here he's not doing bad. His pick rate is not super high with 12%, but still way higher than the patch before. And his ban rate is pretty low as well. And his biggest ban rate resulting from that is towards the lower end, but still something that's acceptable and would not indicate that he was very imbalanced. I honestly can't 100% say what in that patch made him go up so much. There was a change to Heartseeker that made it more beneficial for him as a single damaging item, so that could be an influence here, or certain changes to other solo laners, or maybe even the visual effect of Magi's Cloak being a bit more obvious. But I'm not sure if one of these can fully explain why he went up by 3% that patch. Before we look at the performance stats of the newest patch, I wanted to do something else. Because how it's presented by Hi-Rez is basically that we're just seeing Tyr's Fearless go back to his state from how he was. But I want to go a little bit through the history of Tyr and look at the changes that he had over time in order to see how much of that Tyr from back then, aside of the knockup, is really still left. In a sense, this is a bit of a whatever happened to format here, but we're talking specifically about the buff. So we go back to the start of Season 1, because I think pre-season is another behemoth altogether with all kinds of weird changes going on. But in Season 1, right at the start basically, he got multiple nerfs. First, his power cleave in guard stance was nerfed. The healing was reduced from 45 to 125 to 30 to 110. This will be relevant later, keep that in mind. The healing scaling was reduced from 50% to 30% of your physical power. Then in May, just 1 month later, his attack speed was reduced from 2.1 to 0.9 per level. That's definitely something that we noticed until today. You can't really play attack speed too seriously because it feels super wonky. And his in-hand power per level was reduced from 2.25 to 2. His unyielding would no longer apply to roots and cripples, and they would affect it for the full duration. and his Fearless would no longer cause knockback to enemies while in guard stance. That's the one that we're getting back, so very early that this was actually still a thing. Power Cleave also got nerfed, reducing the base damage from 70 to 270 to 60 to 220, and the physical scaling was increased from 50 to 65% instead, which is a value that remains the same to this day. The healing in guard stance would also completely lose its scaling at this point. It would no longer scale with physical power, something that's not the case today, by the way. Hi-Rez wasn't done with Power Cleave though. In October, the guard stance Power Cleave healing would now heal twice for the first enemy hit and once more for each additional enemy. That was a mistake. That was probably one of the most frustrating mechanics they introduced to him, because it meant that his 1v1 boxing was significantly better with no minions around it. The mechanic of this ability was basically not really being rewarded. The healing was in return reduced from 30 to 110 to 25 to 105 per target with a maximum of 3. But again, that didn't really matter much when you would heal double for the first target anyways. In the second season, he got a change to change stance, increasing the defense stance protections from 8 to 40 to 10 to 50. Also something that still remains the same to this day. And along with that, the cooldown was decreased from 15 to 11 seconds to 14 to 10 seconds. And I would like to say that remains the same today, but there's more changes to that later. But keep in mind that the original cooldown for this ability on level 1, and you had to level it, was 15 seconds. Then the Power Cleave damage was increased from 60 to 220 to 80 to 220, so a bit more at the start. And then moving into Season 3, Change Stance could now be used at rank 0, at level 1. This is something that Tyr previously didn't have, because his Stance Swap wasn't an ultimate compared to some other guards which have a Stance Swap as well. But now he would be able to use it on level 1 anyways, which was very strong for him. That actually caused his performance to be a little bit too good at a later point, and in Season 4 he received a nerf to the defensive stance, with Power Cleave only healing once for the first target. So that was finally reverted, and that was a very good decision. Then Power Cleave also had its mana cost reduced to 50 at all ranks instead of going up to 70, which is interesting from the perspective of one of the downsides of Tyr's kit, of course, being that he uses a lot of abilities with the stance swap, and that usually resulting in relatively high mana usage. Later in Season 4, his Fearless also had a mana cost decreased from 60 to 80 to 50 to 70, and Change Stance would now get an even more reduced cooldown, down from 14 to 10 seconds to 12 to 10 seconds. So we took 3 seconds of the cooldown at the first rank, and also made the first rank accessible at level 1. Pretty big change for that ability alone. January of Season 5 also brought something back that was previously removed. The Power Cleave healing would now scale with your power again. This time it wasn't quite as much though, it was 20%, not 50 or 30 or something, but still a significant impact in my opinion. In Season 5, the defense stance Fearless specifically received multiple buffs. First of all, it would now disarm enemy guards for 1.5 seconds, what we don't have any longer now. It would also now deal separate damage from the assault stance though. The damage was increased from 40 to 240 to 70 to 270. So more damage between both of the Fearless variations. And then in Season 6 in February we also had an increase of the base HP by 10 and the HP per level by 3. And in March we also had an increase of the physical protections, base physical protections, from 15 to 18. And the Power Cleave heal would also be buffed up again. Remember, that was lowered at previous points, and now it would be increased from 25 to 105 to 30 to 130. It still starts off lower, but still ends up at a very high value, though there were of course different iterations that healed more, especially when hitting a single target. So are you still keeping track? Since his knockup was first removed, we had various increases to stats on Tyr, basically across the board. We had the stance swap being made accessible at level 1 with a significantly lower cooldown. We had various changes to the healing, but overall I would say it's still towards the higher end right now than it was in most situations before, especially because the scaling was previously completely removed as well. And we also had some damage increases specifically to Fearless, while Power Cleave remained the same as it was at the time when the knockup was removed, or the knockback was removed. And I think it was important to take this look back to realize that even though we're getting old Tyr back, so to speak, he functions significantly differently, especially in early levels, and he's gotten quite a few buffs in other regards that make him stronger than he was back then. The only way that old Tyr could actually compete with the current version of Tyr is if you were literally using only basic attacks for the entire fight because of the high attack speed. But not only that, we're looking at the guard stats so far. There's also the current meta, and the current meta is not exactly favorable for Tyr, don't get me wrong. We have a very heavy emphasis on late game in many regards, as we can see by builds and playstyles, and Tyr is not the best late game guard. A very skilled Tyr player can be good in late game, but he's not necessarily the greatest, and that's, I think, also a factor in his win rate. But at the same time, the item meta at least is very favorable for Tyr right now. So if we're looking at solo lane, we have Blackthorn Hammer, which even after that nerf is still very accessible and very viable. We have Gladiator Shield as a very cheap, easy sustain item with cooldown reduction, which is nice for Tyr if you really want to go overboard on sustain. And you have Warrior's Blessing, which is absolutely good for him as well as a variety of items with cooldown reduction that work for him. But Tyr is not even limited to solo right now. In that context, it's worth noting that especially Blackthorn and Glad Shield can be useful in any role for him, basically. But he can be played in jungle right now as well, in my opinion. Warriors in jungle are doing pretty decent at the moment, and Tyr should be one of the ones that definitely does decently well, just based on the fact that he doesn't play super differently from Achilles, and Achilles definitely has his ways of being utilized. And Tyr also makes perfect use of these aggressive power hybrid builds that are used. For example, Transcendence is one of the items that is super popular in junglers right now, and Tyr has 235% scaling in his kit without the ultimate, so this is the stuff that you can just spam. If you include the ultimate, it's 355% scaling with 120% scaling in a big AoE. So you're gonna have an impact with that. He also works well with Crusher, an item that wasn't even accessible back in the day because it didn't exist. And he also works well with the new version of Heartseeker. He can proc it 5 times when using his kit once, and he has a very high chance to hit it on multiple targets, at least through the ultimate, but also through the fact that Fearless makes it relatively possible, at least, to hit multiple targets with it. And that's just looking at jungle, and you could even look at Tyr's support with how much CC he has now. And there we are currently in a meta that revolves around an item called Relic Dagger, which would not only be beneficial for the cooldown reduction, but also for using Blink more option with Tyr, which is one of his core setup in many situations. And that's not to mention the other cooldown reduction items that you can fit into a build now that Thebes is basically the meta support item and not something like Sovereignty and Hardwood, which would take away more slots for that kind of stuff. So overall, Tyr has a lot of things going for him right now. But are the statistics telling it the same story? Well, we can't speak about rank just yet because those stats are not available, but we have some stats from Casual Smite. And in Casual Smite, we can see that his win rate has increased by roughly 1% to 49.35%. His KDA has increased by 0.02, and his other values have gone up a little bit as well, but not very significant overall. Now, of course, we have a much smaller number of games at this point, but still, if he was truly broken, then we should see different stats here. Now, the question is, why is that, and does he feel the same way as well? I played Tyr a little bit, and to me, he felt extremely strong. I would say very much ban-worthy in ranked level of strong, because you have so much control over fights and you're so safe at the same time. And the interesting thing here is that his knockup was initially too high after the buff, and Hi-Rez nerfed that, and the stats here include all the games where the knockups were too high, so his stats are actually expected to drop as well. And he didn't feel like that to me at all. I had an extremely easy time playing Tyr, and I am somebody who doesn't play Tyr very much because I really used to not like him, though that grudge has kind of faded at this point. Yet I could still see it coming back up through this buff if players adapt to him. And the question for that for me is, maybe Tyr is not being seen as what he is right now. I think he will primarily be played in solo at the moment, and I think that's where most of these stats are coming from. And in solo, we simply have other forces that dominate at the moment. We have guys like Sun Wukong that used to be one of the more interesting matchups for Tyr, but now Sun Wukong got a massive buff that may very well have shifted the power level in this particular matchup. Or you can look at Jormungandr, who really just laughs at anything that Tyr throws at him. Even Ares is a god that is worth mentioning now. He's more in the meta, typically more in jungle, but he is also a god that does very well against Tyr, so all of those things kind of affect him. But at the same time, we still see Tyr being picked in the Pro League now even before his buff. He was picked against Thor, he was picked against Amaterasu, and he was picked against a Set, and all of those matchups were won. Now this can always be down to the player, of course, but it's still worth mentioning that not everything is bad for Tyr in solo lane, especially those matchups like Thor, like Set, that rely on a lot of lane poke and clear, whereas Tyr can go for the direct bully and also has that constant sustain that allows him to kind of work into that. But what if it's simply this role placement as a solo laner that is holding him back? What if he's actually performing better as a jungler or as a support with the massive amount of setup for potential ganks or for teamfights in general that he has now? We're seeing the level 1 Hercules speed buff invades all the time, but what if you have the same thing with Tyr? He can do that pretty well. He has 2 abilities on level 1 as well, so that should help him even more. In that sense, while he is maybe not performing that highly right now, I'm very curious what's going to happen in regards to the ranked stats, if he's going to go up more there on the higher levels of play, and also in regards to how he will develop in the future and how the SPL will utilize him maybe in different roles. In spite of these stats not indicating it yet, I would not be surprised if we see a nerf to Tyr in the future. Not sure if it's going to be a full revert of the knockup, but I kind of expect it's going to be something else because Harris doesn't like touching the same thing. So I would think he will be adjusted in other ways, maybe looking at the 2 especially here, or maybe even something about the stand swap. Let me know how you guys feel about his current strength in the comments. And if you're new to the channel, feel free to click the sub button and maybe the bell. It really helps me out and it keeps you updated on new videos. Thank you very much for watching and see you for the next one tomorrow. DukeSloth out.